late start. We're trying to do a work tech problem here, but I think we're all set. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the last seminar for this term. This is the City Futures seminar series. It's great to have you all here. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that, at least for those of us here at UNSW, we're meeting on the unceded lands of the Aboriginal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and to any First Nations people joining us today. So I'll introduce Chris Pettit, our director, in a few minutes to introduce today's speaker, but I'll do a little bit of housekeeping as usual. For those of you joining us online, if you could do us a favor and mute your microphone and turn off your camera during the presentation, that would be great. And then you're welcome to turn on your cameras and your microphones at the end during the Q&A if you've got a question. You're also welcome to, at any time, put a question into the chat, and Richard, who's in the back of the room here, will monitor the chat, and so you can ask your question that way as well. So with that, I'll introduce Professor Chris Pettit, who's the Director of City Futures, to introduce today's speaker.
Hey, thanks, Lee. And so it's my honour to introduce our final speaker for the year, Professor Stuart Barr, who's a friend of many of us in Australia. In City Futures, we're just talking about, we just finished up the Australian Housing Data Analytics Platform Phase 1, and Stuart was very instrumental and supportive of that while he was Director of the Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network, AURIN, where he was Director for around 2 years in a very sort of trying time around COVID and so forth. So Stuart was leading that e-research initiative. He's led a lot of e-research initiatives coming from the UK, where he's Professor of Geospatial Systems Engineering in the School of Engineering at Newcastle University. And he's been working on urban models, analytics, geospatial tools, decision support tools for over 20 years. And it's very timely that Stuart's here to talk about his research in modelling urban dynamics for improved climate change impact assessment. Here in Sydney, for those who are here in Sydney, we know the heat waves have already hit. We're already experiencing in the first week of summer plus 40-degree days, up mid 40 degrees in Western Sydney. And this is right at the beginning of summer. We're not talking late January, February. So very topical on how we can use data analytics and models to help us sort of adapt and mitigate climate change. And Stuart's got all the solutions. So over to Stuart.
I wish. Thanks, Chris. And just for the sort of, you like sort of reality check, I don't have all the solutions, but maybe some of the kind of tools that can start to help us work towards deriving sensible solutions around the adaptation and resilience options for cities going forward. So what I want to basically do today is just show you some of the modelling outputs that we've been working on at Newcastle as a couple of large projects in the UK since about 2015, 2016, up to the present day. And just sort of try and highlight maybe some of the tools which we're trying to develop, which are better capturing hopefully urban dynamics in terms of then understanding the impact of future climate forcing on cities. This is timely. Last week I was just attending the International Conference on Urban Heat Islands in Melbourne, and I'm going to show you, my first slide will show you essentially sort of some of the potential future impacts in terms of heating in relation to cities in the UK. I was going in all guns blazing about how dramatic and significant the changes are going to be in terms of UK temperatures and its impact on the urban environment. This was absolutely nothing compared to what was being presented for some of the global south cities into the future. But the point actually for presenting this slide is not so much to look at the particular numbers, which we could spend a whole hour easily unpicking individually as one slide, but it's to try and emphasize that we now see within our climate change programs the ability to develop really quite robust, large ensemble predictions of what the future climate is going to look like in 2050, 2080, 2100, and then understanding the impacts of that climate in terms of future heat, flooding, droughts, so on and so forth. Although we're not particularly good, and this is relevant for the UK, in terms of looking at things like extreme cold spells into the future. The GCMs and the RCMs aren't actually particularly good at picking up issues around cold weather. But nonetheless, we're able to predict really quite robustly now what future climate will actually look like and the impacts on our urban cities, our urban fabric. However, when we're actually doing that impact analysis, those impacts in analytics, we essentially assume, in many cases, that our urban system is actually staying static. Essentially, we look at the impact of future climate on the current population, urban form, urban infrastructure that we all rely on. Okay? And yet we know that over time, that urban fabric is going to change. There's going to be dramatic changes to the type of population demography that we have in our major cities globally. They're going to have different requirements around their housing needs. We're going to have different levels of densification depending on policies in different countries, so on and so forth. And yet we almost exclusively fail to capture that dynamic of the urban fabric when we're looking or asking the question, what will be the impacts in 2050, 2080 or 2100 of a future climate? And that's across the entire piece. So we have within the climate projections piece, we can calculate what the future environmental hazards are going to look like. But our impacts analysis is going to be flawed because we're not taking into account the changing urban fabric. And therefore, any risk mitigation and adaptation, policy, practice, design, ways of engaging with the population, behavioural change that we're going to recommend is also going to be fundamentally flawed because we're not taking into account those changes. Equally as well, we also know that our urban population and the resulting housing and development that we produce from that is incredibly reliant on a whole host of critical infrastructures, which themselves are changing over time. In the UK, there's a current really big debate about how long we can sweat our existing critical infrastructure assets until they actually need replacement, and when is the best time to actually replace them in terms of transport, gas distribution, electricity, clean and wastewater, a whole host of critical infrastructures that we need to take into account into the future and work out what will be the impact of future climate on those infrastructure and the services they provide. And even more complicated is that they are all interdependent on each other. So in fact, an impact on things like the electricity distribution network as a result of extreme future heat will impact on our ability to deliver, for example, transport, our gas distribution, water, so on and so forth. And then we need to bring in the policy space. And in particular, with regards to future development and building in the UK, one of the few things that we're seeing a clear dividing line, or excuse my visual pun, of a clear brick wall between the two major parties in the UK, Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives, the current incumbent government, is around future housing policy. Essentially, over the next 20 years or so, it's estimated by the government themselves that they need to build or develop about 300,000 new homes per annum. At the moment, we're kind of last year, 2022, it was just over 200,000 were actually delivered. So, and it has been as low in the around about 2015 of around about 120,000 new houses. So there's this challenge of, can we actually even deliver the number of houses or new homes that are actually required? And then there's a policy difference. The Labour Party, in a recent talk by Keir Starmer, basically announced that they were going to undertake this challenge of new development housing by developing a whole host of new towns within the UK. So essentially decentralised development outside of the major existing urban conurbations. And Keir Starmer believes that he's able to do this without destroying or tearing apart the existing beautiful green and pleasant lands of the UK. So essentially without damaging and destroying the existing green belt. On the other hand, the incumbent government basically have a very different, radically different view of how to deliver future housing. So in a local speech in July by Michael Gove, who's our so-called Levelling Up Secretary, who's responsible for housing policy and practice, he announced that we are going to regenerate our existing major urban conurbations. And actually he's described them as creating Barcelonas of the north of Europe, essentially these high quality but high density living environments built around the concept of digitization and technology, helping to deliver higher density living but with a stronger or higher quality of life. Okay, so basically really radically, dramatically different approaches to providing future housing in the UK. So we've got climate impacts, and then we've got also this divergence of policy between the two major political parties. And it's been recognised that this is a major problem within the UK around how do we actually plan and deliver one or other of those future visions that are coming from government, and how do we actually work out where we can and how we actually develop and build climate resilient cities and urban areas into the future. And there's been a whole host of initiatives at different levels of government and governance over about the past decade in the UK. So we have, for example, a host of reports and recommendations that have come out from an organisation called the Connected Catapults, which is essentially responsible for driving innovation and academic stroke private sector integration to deliver some of the substantive questions around housing and development in the UK. We have our own infrastructure commission, according to the infrastructure commission that you have in Australia, who've been looking at what do we actually need and how to deliver infrastructure for our cities. And in the UK, we actually also have what's called the Geospatial Commission. So a commission which has been set up to advise government about how to best use of geospatial data, analytics and methods. And in their most recent strategy to 2030 document, they've made a very strong recommendation. In fact, it's their top priority around providing better science and data science and innovation for better use of land within the UK. And this is starting to translate into some real action. So we've had, for example, in our National Institute of Artificial Intelligence and Data Science, the Alan Turing Institute, there was a programme around the use of AI in government for policy making. I'll show you some results from that programme of work that we've done at Newcastle. And then also we've had the recognition that there needs to be an improvement in the digital capability of our planners across the UK. And in particular, Mike Batley from CASA has been chairing and leading this Digital Futures for Planning, or the Digital Task Force for Planning group, in terms of designing and developing a set of recommendations about essentially how to upskill the planning community in the UK to be better prepared for the use of digitisation today and into the future. And then finally, and I'll move very quickly over this one, we have this drive around developing digital twins for the built environment, something that's being mirrored also within Australia through the ANZLIC spatial digital twin set of concepts. We in the UK have what we call the Gemini's principles, and as part of the Gemini's principles, perhaps articulated slightly stronger than in Australia, is this recognition that not only do we need digital twins that can deal with real-time data, but actually digital twins which can actually perform strategic decision support and planning with regard to things like the future use of land and development within the built environment. And so we're we're kind of working quite heavily on utilising this framework in terms of the types of tools that we're developing. So that's a bit of background context in terms of the UK, some of the pressures that we actually have with regards to future climate forcing, the impacts of that, and as I said, some of the problems or issues that we have to deal with future urban development. And in the work that I've been involved in at Newcastle, as I said, for about a decade now, what we've been doing is slowly but surely beginning to develop a multi-scale urban impact assessment framework that can start to hook in some of the future plausible urban dynamics into our climate impact assessment work that we do with our climate change researchers, both at Newcastle and also in other universities in the UK. So in the work that we've been doing at Newcastle, and this is also, I should recognise that we've been working also with CASA, University College London, my Batty, and also with Leeds Institute of Data Analytics, in particular Nick Lomax's Spencer model of microsimulation population. We've been developing a modular approach where essentially we can take a range of different models or analytical tools that allow us to start to simulate future urban development, future urban growth across the built environment. And on the basis of that future simulation, hopefully plausible urban development, they are actually then what we plug in to the impact assessments that utilise the climate change projections of future surface water flooding, tidal flooding, heat wave models, droughts, so on and so forth. So we're starting to combine both the dynamics of the urban fabric and the urban system with the dynamics of the climate system in terms of getting more realistic impact assessments in terms of cost, disruption, and impacts on the population going forward. And as I say, this approach is multi-scale. We have a range of different models that work at different scales or different resolutions across the built environment. And what I'm going to just do now with the rest of the time is just go through and give a couple of examples of some of the tools that we've been developing to do this. I should say that within the framework that we've been developing, we do actually have some exogenous inputs. So, for example, we need inputs on future economic growth within and employment in order to disaggregate that, to understand where population is going to live. And we also need to have future national scale population projections. If we've got those two inputs in terms of future employment, future population, then we can apply this sort of modular multi-scale framework to actually try and work out where plausibly we'll see future urban development. The first piece of work that we ever did with this was for our good friend Boris, when he was still Mayor of Greater London. So this is a piece of work that we did for the Greater London Authority, and as part of a programme called the UK Tyndall Cities programme. The Tyndall Centre is the UK Centre for Climate Change Impacts, and they basically asked us to look at what the future impacts may be on London of certain climate projections, particularly future surface water flooding and also heat. So working with CASA, we basically developed a number of scenarios around future population change. One of the interesting things that we have to take into account is that while the interest was around the Greater London Authority, the boundary that you can see here, there's always been a proposal around developing the so-called Thames corridor out to the east. And so we actually took that into account in terms of our population model in order to make sure that we were accounting for how that may impact on where population may locate within London as a result of potential future development out on the Thames corridor. We looked at 4 scenarios, essentially a pro rata baseline population growth scenario in terms of development across London, in terms of residential development. One which focused on trying to almost, if you like, undertake the Conservative government view of today around densification and higher density living, so-called centralised scenario. An Eastern Corridor one, which pushed or drove population more towards the Thames Corridor and linking this up as a high economic activity area in a set of zones. And then one which is essentially suburban development, essentially removing restrictions on things like greenbelt development and development on the urban greening space. We then took those population projections from the modelling that was undertaken for these different scenarios, and then we developed back in about 2014-15 a model called UDM, an urban development model. And what UDM does is it basically, for each scenario, develops, uses a set of attractors and a set of constraints to try and work out how suitable any location is within the area that you want to potentially develop for the development and the population density and the type of housing development that you would like to see within a particular location. So it's essentially, at one level, a multi-criteria evaluation approach where you basically work out what attractors will drive or deliver development in a particular area, weight those according to how important you perceive them to be in terms of decision for development, and then you get a final suitability surface, such as this one you can see here. So the brighter grey shades are more suitable, the darker grey shades are less suitable for development. So this is obviously the one that we developed for the Eastern Corridor development side of things. We then take that suitability surface and we use that to parameterize or drive a cellular automata model, which then basically tries to go and satisfy the amount of development, particularly in terms of in relation to the amount of housing that you can accommodate for the available land according to the highest areas of suitability. So essentially, the cellular automata starts to develop cells across the spatial domain of interest, in this case London, until it either has completely satisfied the total amount of housing developments needed, or you've overflowed the available amount of population or land that can be accommodated for a particular area. Okay. So you can basically, the red areas here are a result of the urban development as a result of this suitability surface. The yellow areas are existing built up land, and the green is obviously the green space of London. So we ran this for the 4 different scenarios. So you generate a set of attractors and corresponding weights for each scenario. And then we ran UDM, the cellular automata model. And then we looked at how the results of that urban development would be impacted as a result of future expected flooding within London for a 2100 storm surge up the River Thames. And so what we basically found, and this is not surprising, but it's the first time it's actually being tried to be quantified for future urban development, is that the Eastern Corridor development actually results in the lowest future population density. So if you want an urban fabric which isn't going to be high density living or quite as high density living as other parts of London, then you would develop into the Eastern Corridor. But the actual annual impact of that development in terms of cost of flooding is actually much higher, significantly higher than any other scenario for London. So it's time to show you what those trade-offs are with regards to low density living, but then the impact that that will have in terms of higher costs with regards to flood damage. The other interesting thing we managed to do in UDM is it's got, when we overflow the available density or available land for a zone, we allow it to be transferred, or one of the options we can run it in is it allows it to be transferred to other zones where there's actually still available land as during the model run. And so we can start to look at how we can take, for example, land which is going to be impacted or future development impacted by the flooding in the future, and then move that to a different actual, in this case, different ward in London in order to actually try and remove that risk. So we can actually start to look at what the adaptation options are about where you might build as an alternative within London or within your urban fabric going forward. And we've been using UDM now for quite a number of studies. So this is actually, as I said, some of the outputs that we worked on in part as part of the Alan Turing AI in governance project. And what we were asked to do in this particular piece of work was to look at the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. So there's a proposal, or there has been a proposal for, again, nearly the best part of a decade, for trying to remove some of the pressure from population growth and development in London by actually developing further this corridor, which is sort of to the west and north of London, called the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. And essentially, the proposal is more or less that 2 million new people would actually live there. There'd be in the order of about 1 million new homes actually developed to accommodate them. And also that there'd be a whole host of new infrastructure investments. So a new railway line that was linking Oxford, Milton Keynes and Cambridge, and also a new dual carriageway, major A road, that would also be connecting them. And what the interest was in this piece of work, again, was to look at a number of different scenarios about what it would mean with regards to where you would actually develop or accommodate that future 1 million people within the Oxcam corridor. 4 scenarios, again, a baseline one where we just accepted pro rata growth of the existing population density within each of the wards, again, within the Oxcam corridor. One where we actually had a new town development and actually developed, so essentially implementing the kind of current Labour vision around what future development would look like in the UK. A sort of unplanned scenario where basically it's carte blanche. You just found the most suitable land regardless of what current land use activity was present within it, and you developed it. And then one which is essentially a sprawl and an expansion model. So essentially saying, take the existing population centres of Cambridge, Milton Keynes and Oxford and allow them to grow into the future. And what we're looking at here is actually the sort of change in population expected by 2050 for each of the zones, the administrative zones within the Oxcam corridor, so under those 4 scenarios. And again, we ran UDM on this to actually look at what the spatial pattern of urban development would be. And in particular, what was of interest to the people at Turing who were involved in this sort of AI in government and science program were these 2 scenarios. One around what if we just allowed existing major conurbations to grow and expand, so Oxford, Cambridge and Milton Keynes. And essentially what you found was that you almost completely destroyed the surrounding green belt. You can't accommodate that number of people and those number of houses or developments into the future without actually decimating any existing green belt around Oxford, Cambridge and Milton Keynes in particular. The new town development, however, while it looks actually far more dramatic and impactful, you can actually deliver that in a way that actually requires less sacrifice of the green belt. And if you're careful about where you locate these new urban conurbations, actually one where you don't actually destroy as much of the natural capital as you would through the expansion scenario. So it's almost counterintuitive that if you're careful about where you actually choose to locate these large, major, new, significant urban conurbations, in actual fact, it is actually possible to reduce both the environmental and natural capital impacts and also greenbelt erosion within this particular area. So that's two examples of how we've been doing or using population models and then an urban development model, UDM, at a kind of regional scale or single city scale, regional scale. And what we've been asked to do most recently is to actually do this nationally for the whole of the UK. And this is part of a large programme called the Open Climate Impacts Framework, or Open CLIM, which is looking at essentially developing a national strategic digital twin for future climate impacts across multiple sectors in the UK. So looking at cities, but also looking at agricultural production, the potential impacts on natural capital, so on and so forth. And this has brought together people who are working on climate scenarios, the hazard modelers who leverage off those climate scenarios, people doing the socioeconomic work, so the economics and the population modelers, and then also people like myself, my team at Newcastle, where we look at the kind of future urban dynamics, forms, and the vulnerability of the urban system and infrastructure into the future. And the idea is that by bringing these groups together, you can undertake a really realistic risk assessment with regards to future climate impacts across the whole of the UK. As part of this, we were challenged, and it has been a challenge, to develop UDM in a way that it could be applied to the whole of the United Kingdom in a single run. So it wasn't just chopping up separate parts of the UK, but it was able to actually do this for the whole of the United Kingdom in one single pass, taking into account all the different regional drivers, attractors, and constraints around land development in the UK. We were also slightly challenged in that the scenarios we had to work with were coming from work which has been done at Cambridge Econometrics around future scenarios of economics, employment, and population. So we had 5 scenarios for the whole of the UK that we had to work with. They're called the socioeconomic pathways. The first one's sustainability, essentially where we all turn to green infrastructure and become far more understanding around carbon budgeting. The second one is called middle of the road. That's not a kind of business as usual. The middle of the road one is there's still some quite dramatic transformations taking place in the UK, such as things like increased private-public partnership around the delivery of social infrastructure, but essentially less dramatic in terms of population change. We have a regional rivalry run where we just essentially allow the whole of the UK to compete against each other with no top-down government intervention at all. An inequality one where essentially different regions in the UK are able to adopt new technology and digital in different ways, leading to potential socioeconomic disadvantage. And then one where we basically still live by our beautiful fossil-fueled current existence, and in fact we max out on the utilisation of carbon and fossil fuels into the future. And what they do is they all give us slightly different, in the case of SSP5, the fossil fuel one, dramatically different population projections for the whole of the UK. So as I said, what we did is that we developed a UDM set of weights and attractors for each of those scenarios. We were working with stakeholders across different levels of government and engaging with them with around how we should be weighting the importance and what those attractors should actually be, and then working out what the different constraints should be with regards to each of those scenarios. And then, as we did for London, we essentially developed, but in this case, a national scale suitability for development for each of those scenarios. So on the right-hand side, or left-hand side, as you're looking at it, We have SSP2, development suitability, SSP4 in the middle, and then the SSP5 on the right-hand side. And what we can see here is that you get really significantly different suitability patterns for the whole of the UK, depending on which of these futures or pathways around the economics and employment population you utilise. And then we ran UDM for each of those scenarios. Okay? And not surprisingly, we get really dramatically different patterns of plausible future development for each of those scenarios from UDM. And in fact, the kind of most dramatic one, not surprisingly, I guess, is around the kind of future use of fossil fuels. And that if we really max out on that, not only do we see massive and huge urban development and urban sprawl around the existing major urban conurbations of the UK, London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, but because of North Sea oil and because of the ability under that scenario to still utilise it intensively, it's really significant urban growth and development across Scotland as well, particularly across its central belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh. Just to try and emphasise the impact that some of these future scenarios would actually have on UK in terms of development. And again, most dramatically, if you adopted or if we found population growth which came out of the continued use or high level use of fossil fuels into the future, you would have virtually no available green space left in London. You'd have to virtually develop the whole of London in order to accommodate the future population projections. Somewhat more horrifyingly, this scenario is closer to the 300,000 developments a year for England than SSP2 is over here, where we've actually got a lower population growth occurring for London, less housing needed. This is actually closer to what we're able to deliver in terms of housing development currently today. Okay? So while we were slightly sceptical about how plausible some of these scenarios are, when you actually go and look at the numbers, these start to come out actually not being too far away from what actually the government are aiming to try and achieve over the next 20 years. I'm conscious of time, so I'll skip through this very quickly, but some of the work that we've moved on to more recently is while UDN gives us a feel for where you can build to accommodate future population, to achieve a particular density of development for a particular type of housing or development type, it doesn't kind of actually give you, if you like, a layout of the form and the fabric of that resulting development. So we've been working on, in the last couple of years, the development of what we call an urban fabric generator, UFG. And that essentially takes the outputs from UDM and downscales it into plausible, typical urban fabrics or layouts of buildings, green space, and the road network at the current moment. And the way we've done this is we've taken a piece of work by a guy called Tony Hargreaves from Cambridge University School of Architecture. And what Tony looked at was the different housing mix or building mix you get residentially for different densities of dwellings per hectare. And so we've used this to essentially translate that into a set of spatial prototypes of what the actual configuration might look like for those types of dwelling mix for the number of dwellings you're getting per hectare. And then we use that again within a kind of elaborate agent-based model to then simulate the total layout of all the new development that you get from the UDM model. And as part of the outputs from the UDM model, we know the density per hectare, we know the housing mix or dwelling type mix per hectare, and we basically just simulate what our future urban form may actually look like as a result of that. And we've been applying this within the Open CLIM project, so the UK Climate and Impacts work. And this is just an example of the different urban layouts that you get as a result of some of the different scenarios and future pathways of economics, employment and population. So the kind of low population growth scenario over here, and we get virtually no impact on development within this existing urban green space area. Within the inequality one, however, we find that we have to develop into this urban green space to accommodate the population, and here's the typical layout you may get. And under SSP5, the kind of sort of worst case scenario, if you like, then we get a slightly different type of urban development. So we're getting, for example, more high-rise apartments being developed, flats being developed, compared to smaller individual dwellings within SSP4 to accommodate the population. And then what we do is we go away and we talk to our impact modelers, and they run over the top of that new urban fabric and the existing urban fabric things like their surface water flood model. And then we take the outputs from that surface water flood model, and then we put it into a damage calculation model, and we actually then can work out what the actual impact will be in terms of total damages, not just on the existing urban fabric, but in terms of also the new urban build that we might have in 2080 as a result of the population change. So we've got really, for the first time, at least in the UK, this detailed coupling between future urban form and growth and development and the future climate impacts in terms of the hazards. And we can work out things like total expected damages, number of residential buildings that will be affected, number of non-residential buildings that will be affected. We've also looked at this for future infrastructure provision. So as I said earlier in the talk, we're not only interested in what we would build in terms of future housing, but also what it needs in terms of future infrastructure. And in this particular piece of work, we took some of the results from the Oxford-Cambridge corridor analysis we did. We ran a surface water flooding model over it for a 1 in 100 year future flood. And we looked at two different scenarios. One where we provided for the new urban development, new urban build, the existing minimum specification in terms of water drainage along the roads. And then we doubled that and then looked and compared the different surface water flood impacts. So if we just took the existing current best practice around urban surface drainage, we get this sort of runoff pattern with at least in many areas 40 centimetres surface water flooding for a future event which is not going to become uncommon into the future. Whereas we take or double the investment in terms of surface water drainage, we actually can almost entirely reduce the impact of that particular flood on our future urban fabric. So again, another way that we can start to link into what we're building into future infrastructure needs as well. Very finally, very, very quickly, and this is some relatively early doors work that we've been doing where at the moment, most of the impact analysis we do with models like UDM and the Urban Fabric Generator, we do just for a single impact or a single hazard. It might be just for flooding, it might be for heat, so on and so forth. But we know that nearly always what we're trying to solve are multi-objective problems, that we want to know what will be the best way that we can build and develop in the future that is sensitive to future heat and so sensitive to future flooding, and also allows us to have reduced travel times and therefore decarb the transport network, so on and so forth. And so we started to put this into what we refer to as a multi-objective urban adaptation and options framework. And we've been working and looking at weighing up different sustainability options and then whether they are positively correlated with each other. If you have a positive impact in one, you'll have another positive impact in another one, or whether there's actually a negative correlation, that if you impact or develop or improve what one sustainability option, it may well actually have a negative consequence on another one. And what we've been doing is we've been using evolutionary computing and optimization approaches to actually try and put this into what we refer to as being an options framework. And so we take the urban development model, and we've been wrapping around that a genetic algorithm, which basically takes multiple or hundreds of thousands of outputs of UDM and actually basically tries to work out across multiple objectives which of them are actually the most robust in terms of minimizing the objectives that we're interested in. And so for London, we've been looking at heat simultaneously at the same time as flooding, also in terms of trying to retain and develop future urban centres and minimise transport and travel to work in London, while also looking at constraints around not obviously being able to develop in the current urban fabric, looking at urban brownfield focused development and centralisation of development, and also incorporating density or regulation and policy into this framework as well. And so essentially trying to optimise, for example, all of those 6 considerations at the same time. And what we do is we, as I said, we use the genetic algorithm wrapped around UDM, and then we use Pareto-optimal optimization to look and try and unpick out of these potentially hundreds of thousands of plausible solutions, the subset which are all equally as good as each other, and the best subset out of that total number of solutions that you can actually generate. And so rather than thinking of this problem as being an optimization, we're thinking of it as understanding what the options are or the trade-offs are between different objectives in the problem space that we're looking at. The trade-offs in this case between heat and distance to travel to work, for example. And so we can see here that if we have to travel further to work, then that reduces our heat risk. But if we want to reduce our heat risk, it means we have to be able to travel further to work going forward. And so we use it perhaps optimization. And we've looked at this in comparison to the London plan. And when we actually looked at this across 5 objectives simultaneously, we can actually find a Pareto-optimal front, which gives us at least one option where we can improve the risk of flooding by 92% compared to the current London development plan, reduce heat by only by 0.5%, but still a reduction, reduce the impact of future green space by 15%, reduce urban sprawl by 68%, so we can still protect London's green belt, and reduce potential travel emissions by 42% into the future. So, and we can actually map this. You can actually start to understand where and how you would develop on the basis of this type of multi-objective analysis. And the really neat thing about this is you can then take those hundreds of thousands of potential solutions and you can take your subset of them, the Pareto-optimal front, but then you can plug them into actually looking and searching along that Pareto-optimal front for the different scenarios that you might want to see for your urban future. So you can ask the question, where on the Pareto-optimal front will I have a low carbon future, where access to jobs and services is easy, so minimising transport and travel to work, I'm minimising urban sprawl, so on and so forth. And you can search across that multiple dimensional Pareto-optimal front to actually then unpick what actually are the consequences in terms of fitness, normal, in this case, normalised fitness, for the different objectives that you're interested in. It seems, at the moment, I'd say this is quite early days in this work, seems a really powerful way that we can take really quite complex outputs of modelling and analysis and then simplify it, hopefully, for practitioners going forward in terms of understanding the types of outputs that we're generating. I'll leave it there. I've probably gone chronically over time, and apologies, but hopefully that's been of some interest.
So we do have about 5 minutes for questions. Let's see, we had a hand up there for a second. Was it a question online? No. Well, in the meantime, any questions in the room?
I'm online.
Okay.
I've got one. I've got actually quite a few, but is it SSP5 a valid objective, or is it more of a dummy variable in there to the extent?
If you talk to Cambridge Econometrics, they would say that the parameterization they've used for that scenario is realistic around one where if there was a decision to absolutely max out the existing use of fossil fuel and North Sea oil, etc., and that we did absolutely nothing around decarbing transport, which is the big one, then they would say that what comes out of that in terms of the economics and the population are realistic. Now, of course, let's hope we never have a policy or a government that would ever go down to or go that extreme. Equally, we've seen drift by the UK government in the last 3 months over the EVs, electric vehicle policy. And as a result of that, people are beginning to sort of look at that one and actually say, actually, how implausible is it in the future?
Sorry.
I mean, and I wasn't keen when we saw the results from that and thinking that we actually then had to model it, because it gives you the kind of perfect red top headline for in the UK, the Daily Mail, the Express, which says, UK's green and pleasant lands. Academics are saying we can't use cars anymore because there won't be any green space in London. And that's something I'm always a bit cautious about when you try to model these really extreme scenarios. But the climate change programme wanted us to do it.
Consider it.
Time.
Sure, and we've got one question online.
Okay, we'll do the online one.
Okay, so the question is, was any AI or machine learning method used or applied in the national scale UDM?
No, it's very much based around, or was very much based around, a kind of quite a long-winded exchange and discussion with key government departments, key local authorities, etc., around trying to get those attractors, constraints, and weights sorted. But you can see how you could start to, try to automate that process using machine learning going forward. The derivation of the weights is done through the classic multi-criteria evaluation approach. So it's still analytically derived, but as we all know, that is incredibly sensitive to how you configure your pairwise comparison matrix. And so if you're not capturing in that the essence of what the planners or the people who know what the key attractors and constraints are, then you've got a problem there. What we haven't done, and we didn't have time to do in the programme, and I think again would be something we're looking to try and embed in UDM going forward, is the ability to do an uncertainty and sensitivity analysis over those weights. So, if you were to perturb them, stochastically, what would you actually get as a result of that? So you're getting some degree of uncertainty envelope type calculation.
Okay, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but this is fantastic modelling, and any government should give their a limb or two to try and get some real understanding of how the impacts of these potential changes are going to happen and the alternatives. the issue is, and I'd say you touched on it, is how do you manage the politics around this? I mean, you've seen recently what happened about ULEZ in the Uxbridge by-election. You know, basically, we're told, led to a real political backlash against potential, which was a minor, to my mind, and I think most people's minds, policy change, which would limit car use in that area. There's a real politics around this, and you know the Daily Mail will jump on this,
yeah.
and you know if this worst case scenario gets published, as I'm sure it will be, that's what you're going to have to manage. And so I do worry that these very sophisticated and essentially well-meaning attempts to unpack and foresee, you know, say, well, these are the options. You do this, this is what's going to happen, are going to be mangled in the worst case political punch up, which is going to happen. So you're obviously mindful of that, but I'm just sort of putting it on the table as how does it work?
Yeah, and I think the in a way, as a academic doing this type of work, at least in the UK context at the moment, because there is a real genuine awareness around getting a handle on what future climate impacts are going to be, and because we have these national scale programs, which are, you know, acting as umbrellas over the type of work that we do, there's a kind of, at the moment, safety net that we just get to pass the buck. That we say, actually, you know, it's down to the Alan Turing Institute. If you're going to go out and say these are the outputs that have been generated with our AI and government program, it's down to you to think about the messaging of it. You know, if it's the UK climate change program, you know, that's down to you to think about how you do that. That is I can see Chris, that is a cop out, but at the moment it's what we have available. I think what I think is a real challenge, and always will be, is around how do we translate it so the narrative, the messaging that's coming out of these types of studies are firstly accurate, and secondly understandable to different groups through different lenses. And that comes back to the issue, the real long-standing issue that we have, is that our ability, partly through because it's not considered to be particularly interesting to fund, is our inability to develop the kind of visualization and genuine decision support tools that people are going to use. And I'm utterly convinced that the biggest challenge we'll have in the next decade is not doing the modelling. I think we're getting a really good handle on that now, but it's actually how then do we translate and communicate that in a coherent and sensible way when you've got multiple actors with multiple interests in it. So I know I'm not answering your question.
No, you are right.
It's a genuine challenge.
I mean, this will be into the political maelstrom before you can say.
I mean, I actually have a slide which is called the elephant in the room. So it's a big elephant, loads of people, and it then's got a Mike Batty quote. And there's a conference called Modelling the World back in 2016, and Mike stood up and said, "I spent 40 years writing models. I've suddenly realised I've got to spend the next 40 years actually telling people what they mean."
Correct.
That is the problem.
Thanks.
Great. Well, we're just after 1, so we'll wrap up there. Thanks again for a great presentation, and yeah, that was terrific.
No
Thanks.
problem.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
And thanks for everybody for joining us for what maybe was our first lunchtime seminar in this series. So that was great. And our next one coming up will be in February 23rd. So look out for invitations for that as we kick off the seminar series for 2024. And thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good end of your year. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Great.